Can we see it? Okay, cool. So as I said already, today's presentation is a longer one, about 25 minutes, and so that leaves us with a little less time for discussion, and I apologize for that, but there was a lot to cover. The ending time is set for about 8:30 tonight, but if people want to continue after that point, we could go until 9, and if you have to take off before then, no worries at all. We'll play it by ear. So hey everyone, today's topic is one of mindfulness, self-compassion, happiness, healing, and psychedelics. The summer term of school, I've been taking a class about the intersection of between Buddhism, mindfulness, and where the psychology of happiness interplays with these concepts. So this class has been very inspirational to me this summer, and so today I'm going to attempt to bring psychedelics into the mix. I've always felt that mindfulness and psychedelics go hand in hand with one another, and I think many people who have studied or experienced both will agree. There is something quite familiar in the effects of long-term mindfulness practices and the more short-term experience of a psychedelic trip. And so today I shall try and explain this familiarity, utilizing both psychological studies and theories, as well as talking about Buddhism and their ideas of mindfulness and even enlightenment. One thing I would like to point out before we start, Buddhism can be generally considered an organized religion, but it can also be viewed from an ideological standpoint. It is generally accepted within the practices that everyone is free to learn from and take what they will from the Buddhist teachings, and leave behind what doesn't resonate with them. Essentially, you do not have to call yourself a Buddhist, even if you are practicing meditation or yoga. I say this because cultural appropriation is an ongoing battle with relatively unclear borders that are constantly being reworked, one which the psychedelic world engages in from time to time, ayahuasca ceremonies, for example. And so I would like to make it clear that Buddhism encourages everyone, regardless of any background, to make use of and practice their teachings. I personally will never condone cultural appropriation, and I will continue to learn about the ever-changing ideas and boundaries around it, and I encourage you all to do the same. So first we shall be discussing mindfulness and its many benefits. Mindfulness can be described as a state of open awareness to the present moment and usually involves being the outside observer to one's own thoughts and feelings, emotional as well as physical, and how emotional and the physical state influence one another. The important part is to sit with those thoughts and feelings, not judging them as neither good nor bad. In this state, one is able to release the self from thoughts or feelings about the past, which is when we can experience longing and depression, or thoughts and feelings about the future, which is when anticipation and anxiety can spring up. So within the practice of mindfulness, we can start to objectively understand our own experience and not attach too much meaning or judgment towards our thoughts or our concepts of self. The purpose of reaching a mindful state is to understand one's inner processes and experiences, and doing so cultivates perspective on one's consciousness and self, which in turn brings peace into one's life, both mentally and relationally. This type of mindset can be incredibly important for conflict work, for example. By understanding your own mental processes and then taking a step back from that, you can also take a step back from a heated conflict you may be having. Becoming detached can also help in the process of seeing where the other is coming from. And when you take the other side, true conflict resolution and understanding can occur. I'm using conflict as an example here because conflict is a major source of unhappiness and discontentment in our lives. And so to become aware of how to properly conduct conflict is to add a deep happiness and contentment back into our lives. This can only occur once we are aware and comfortable within ourselves. So not only that, but the practice of mindfulness is yet another tool, useful tool to quiet the default mode network if our brains are running amok with worry and rumination. If you were here last time, or just, you already have a general understanding of the default mode network, then you'll know about this already. But if you weren't, or if you don't, I'll also do a quick review. Depression, as well as sense of self or general mindset, is perpetuated by what is called the default mode network. This is a network of areas in the brain that are controlled by the thalamus, which in turn directs signals coming from the body into different areas of the brain. We learned that with the experience of depression, these signals are sent to areas that are sources of rumination, areas which are related to our self-evaluations, as well as how we perceive others to evaluate us. When under the influence of psychedelics, for example, our default mode network works differently than how it usually works. With psilocybin, the typical function of the default mode network is quieted, and the connections are allowed to be made all over the brain rather than just the specific emotional processing areas that depression directs the signals to. This is how psilocybin helps reduce the experience of depression, and longer-term changes can be made with enough time and work. We also learned that the default mode network is most active when the brain is not focused on a specific task, which is why depression or anxiety feel the worst when you have nothing to do, such as when you're trying to go to bed. However, when focused on a specific task, the default mode network is once again quieted. One of the best ways to do this is in meditation and other mindfulness techniques, such as yoga, but we will get into that in a bit. So moving on now to Buddhism, as this ideology is one of the very first to center itself fully around the idea and experience of being mindfully aware of one's own thoughts and existence, so as to step outside of the self. First, let's start with the concept of sati. Sati is the state of being present in the moment, which involves active attention and awareness to this moment. It is considered the first step towards enlightenment. The rough translation of the word from the ancient Pali language is the term mindfulness. This is the state we experience when we meditate. Let's also consider the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism. Put simply, life has inevitable suffering. That's number one. Number two, there is a cause to our suffering. Number three, there is an end to suffering. And number four, the end to suffering is contained in the Eightfold Path, which we shall talk about. Perhaps these statements resonate with you and perhaps they stir up emotions within you. This is all okay. If emotions are popping up, meditate on that. Try and ask yourself, why does this make me uncomfortable? Oh no, I went too far. 1 second. From current slide. Okay, cool. So, oh no, wait, nope, still went too far, maybe. Just one slide back. Okay, there we go. Cool. Okay, so to reach a little deeper into this concept, let's start with number one. Life has inevitable suffering. This might be a scary realization to realize or to face at first, one with which most will want to push away, especially if one is in the habit of hiding from uncomfortableness, which is natural. But the sooner one can understand and accept this concept, the sooner true contentment can be achieved. This might be a realization that comes to you during a challenging trip. Let it wash over you and feel that feeling, but do not get caught up in it. There are things that we can do to reduce the suffering, and the first step is acceptance. It is also important to note here what we mean when we say life has inevitable suffering. Suffering isn't actually the best translation here. Unsatisfactoriness is a better word to describe this particular brand of suffering. To tie this concept back into what we talked about last month and to bring psychology into the mix, this feeling is described through the idea of the hedonic treadmill. Essentially, there are many things in life that bring us short-term happiness. Acing a test, getting promoted, finding a life partner, getting married, buying your first home, etc. These are all things that get us very excited and happy for a while at least. Some events bring more happiness than others, but think about these exact moments in your own life. The happiness doesn't stay around forever, does it? And so we tend to get trapped in this idea that we need more and more and more constantly, or the happiness goes away. And then when bad things do happen, as they do, the floor falls out from under us and we cannot cope with being unhappy because we have not trained the mind to do so. To be clear about the science behind this concept, the hedonic treadmill shows that both happiness after a positive event and as well as unhappiness after a negative event will always return back to your baseline level of happiness. So sometimes people hear this and they think that they cannot buy things that make them happy, or that they shouldn't strive to become married or buy a house one day, or that they shouldn't enjoy or savor their favorite TV shows or food. But that is not the point. The point is to realize that these are temporary happinesses, ones that cannot be constantly relied on. There is more to the story of happiness than that. The unhappiness comes from constant seeking of short-term pleasures. Bringing it back around to psychedelics, this is something that comes to my brain often during a trip. I awaken to the truth of why I do things. 2 or 3 years ago, for example, I had taken some acid and I was hanging out with my roommate on our porch. My roommate and I were very into smoking cigarettes at the time, and so we were out there doing just that, as we usually did. But then I looked at the cigarette in my hand and I had to question myself. Why am I doing this to myself? It doesn't make me happy beyond the first few seconds. This is a very temporary pleasure for the potential of long-term suffering and illness in my future. Then I felt sick and I had to put the cigarette out, and since then I only smoke rarely. And a similar thing has happened to me with alcohol as well, like pretty recently. So moving on, let's talk about truth number 2, although I've already touched on it somewhat. There is a cause to our suffering, and that cause is desire. Desire to have what we do not have, and desire to have what other people have that we feel like we should also have, and desire to be someone or something that we are not. In this case, desire would be translated more closely to clinging. It is an unrelentless feeling of unworthiness within the self. feeling that you're not okay unless you are getting what you desire. If you're caught up in the hedonic treadmill, you might feel like, if only I had this, then I would be happy forever. But this is not a useful mindset to have, because once you get whatever that is, eventually you will return to your baseline happiness level. And so to cling to material objects is to perpetuate desire, aka suffering. So truth number 1 and 2 are diagnosis of suffering per se. What is the cure? Truth 3 and 4. Let's move on to those. Dang it, I did it again. 1 second, y'all. Okay. All right, did that help? Nope. Okay. I'm sorry about that. Okay. Okay, there we go. All right. So truth number 3, there is an end to suffering. The cure is learning to let go of our desires and our clinging to these desires. Even psychology can state that this is no way to achieve happiness, as we see with the hedonic treadmill theory. We must learn to let go of our attachments to the self, to others, to objects, even to the idea of how things should be. Psychedelics bring you there almost immediately, and it can be shocking at times. It can be painful in some ways to let go of these ideas, especially when our concepts of self are extremely tied into who we feel like we are as people, and more importantly, to what we own. But this is letting our pride and our egos get in the way of seeing things in a more objective, unattached light. If you no longer think about objects in terms of my car or my house or simply my belongings, you reduce suffering if something major happens to remove these things from your life, such as your car breaking down or your house burning down, etc. Okay, so truth number 4, the Eightfold Path is the path to the cessation of suffering. As I mentioned previously, you do not have to become a Buddhist in order to learn from and understand the Eightfold Path. These teachings are useful to everyone everywhere. The Eightfold Path is a list of the 8 primary teachings that Buddhists follow and attempt to use in their daily lives. Here it is, and along the way, I will make short notes about a few of the steps. So number 1 is right view or right understanding. This is insight into the true nature of reality. So as a short note, psychedelics are major in this type of insight, because they bring us outside of ourselves, so we can start to see things as they truly are, as well as creating connections all across the brain to realize things that we would not have otherwise, opening the doors of perception, if you will. Number 2 is right intention, which is the unselfish desire to realize enlightenment. Number 3 is right speech, using speech compassionately. Number 4, right action, using ethical conduct to manifest compassion. Number 5, right livelihood, making a living through ethical and non-harmful means. Another short note, it is interesting to me that psychedelics seem to go hand in hand with questioning how harmful capitalism can be, and realizing how little we actually need, and to question our participation in this constant consumer culture that capitalism perpetuates. So number 6 is right effort, which is cultivating wholesome qualities and releasing unwholesome qualities. Number 7 is right mindfulness, so whole body and mind awareness. And number 8 is right concentration, meditation or some other dedicated concentrated practice such as yoga. So a short note, do not get it caught up in the meaning of right. This is not a practice of rights or wrongs. If you do not practice these things, it does not mean that you are not, or that it does not mean that you are wrong. Instead, right here means wise, wholesome, skillful, or ideal. Buddhists, just as psychonauts, are not here to shame people into thinking the way that they do. Instead, seek to understand these concepts for yourself and then live by example, gently guiding along the way if invited to do so. Okay, so as we can see, this is not an easy way out, green run down the mountain, just the psychedelic healing is not an easy way out either. It takes daily practice, but I think it's easy to see the usefulness of doing so. Also, notice how compassion is a key element of the Eightfold Path, and notice how unselfish it is. This is how we can begin to loosen the ideas of the self, of our ego. Psychedelics go hand in hand with this. The reason I am talking about Buddhism is because these are very useful steps that help perpetuate and integrate the lessons we learn during our trips. We can learn to use the Eightfold Path to our advantage, to integrate what we learn during our trips and practice these concepts in our daily, waking, sober lives. During this presentation, I want to discuss compassion as well as self-compassion, and how important those concepts are for our overall well-being. Speaking of which, let's move now to a brief overview of happiness and well-being, as that is the goal for many who participate in psychedelic healing. as a way to reduce depression, anxiety, and other forms of suffering. This will be reviewed from my last presentation, so if you're there, you'll already know a bit about this. So happiness versus contentedness. First, we must ask, what does it mean to be happy? Is our goal to be undyingly happy every moment of every day? Well, of course not. That is unfortunately not realistic, and other emotions and emotional states can be important indications that you are truly alive. Not only that, but as we see with the hedonic treadmill, what most think of as happiness will eventually fade, giving way to our usual baseline of emotion. What can be striven for, however, is the idea of well-being and inner contentedness. Experiencing happiness at different moments is certainly a part of that, but long-lasting contentedness isn't something momentary and must be worked towards. Happiness is the experience of joy and pleasure within any given moment, which is bound to fade eventually and is usually brought on by a thought or an event. Contentedness, on the other hand, could be described as the feeling that no matter what happens to you, you are sure and solid within yourself, and you know that everything will be okay in the end. This feeling that, once cultivated and practiced daily, is hard to shake. You feel satisfied with where you're at in your life and your personal growth, and you're constantly striving forwards into growth and self-meaning. So essentially, there is no denying that deeper forms of well-being can be achieved through this idea. This is the eudaimonic view of well-being, one that may bring about the feeling of contentedness. This theory states that happiness alone isn't necessarily correlated to overall well-being, which is the goal. So the term eudaimonic well-being comes from the idea that well-being is achieved through living in accordance to your daimon, i.e. your true self. This means understanding what your true values are and engaging in activities that fully mesh with and holistically engage in those deeply held values. For me, that means dedicating my life to learning about and teaching others how to best help themselves with the use of psychedelics. It's actually fascinating to me how much more well integrated I feel in my life doing this type of work. It allows me to be my authentic self, and it gives me incredible drive and a feeling of purpose. This is what is called eudaimonia, and it relates to Maslow's idea of self-actualization, which is brought on through autonomy, personal growth, self-acceptance, life purpose, mastery, and positive relatedness to others. In this state of well-being, you are no longer merely existing, but instead flourishing. Psychedelic healing might start you on this path or show that you can achieve this contentedness, but we must put in the work between shifts to integrate this knowledge and then find how we can practice these ideas in our waking or sober lives. Meditation and considering the Eightfold Path is a great way to do so. American work culture has mostly forgotten about this type of true contentedness and being okay with what you have. This kind of work culture can trap us into thinking that if we are not achieving all we can be all the time, that we are nothing. This is a dangerous and toxic mindset to be in, as it does not allow for or encourage true personal growth or contentedness. Rather than doing what you are told, question why you are told to do or feel certain things. Don't just float on the surface of life, get down and dirty into the thick of it. So as we can see, mindfulness is a major component to being contented in our lives, as well as becoming the best person you can be, which I think is a major goal for many in the psychedelic realm. Psychedelics naturally bring you into a state of heightened mindfulness by shutting off or changing the effects of the default mode network. So let's talk about something else you can do in order to get the most out of your trips and integrate the psychedelic lessons smoothly. Talk about meditation. So there are so many types of meditation and ways to practice meditation, but essentially the purpose is to bring you into the present by giving you something in the present moment to continually focus on, to bring you out of being caught up in your thoughts and emotions. It is a daily reminder that you are not your thoughts or emotions, whether those are good or bad. You become the silent observer to say, that's an interesting thought, and then let it go if it's not important or if it does not serve you. As I've mentioned previously, meditation quiets the default mode network. The default mode network will always attempt to retake control of the brain, and this is what most call the monkey brain or racing thoughts. It is important, however, to learn how to quiet the default mode network without the constant intake of psychedelics, as we cannot be on them 24/7. Most meditation asks you to focus on the breath, and that is because the breath is always there with us. It is as constant as our thoughts, and so it makes for a convenient thing to focus on. It also helps us go inward so we can then dissolve the boundary between self and non-self. Mindfulness also has a myriad of benefits, some of which you can see on the screen right now. But for example, compassion, mindfulness and compassion seem to go hand in hand with one another. Drawing on a journal article written by Shauna Shapiro for Greater Good magazine, She learned with her experience of meditation and talking with this particular monk who told her, mindfulness is not just about paying attention, but also how you pay attention. The monk went on to describe a type of attention that is compassionate and kind. And this next part will be important for those of you who have a hard time meditating, who get frustrated towards the self when the mind ceaselessly wanders, which only serves to ingrain the frustration and self-criticism in the brain. Become curious about your own mind wandering about. Hold that experience in compassionate awareness. It is similar to when a parent feels compassionately towards their child. I care about you. I'm interested. Tell me about your experience. So now we know what mindfulness is, we know roughly how to start to achieve it, but how do psychedelics come into the mix? Well, as mentioned previously, psychedelics put us into a place of mindfulness, one that tends to be relatively free of judgment towards the self, especially when done properly. And this is backed up by scientific studies of both psychedelics and entheogens. Entheogens being substances such as MDMA and even 2CB, called so due to their abilities to enhance sensorial perception. Their mechanisms of action within the brain are similar, but slightly different to psychedelics. So on screen in a minute, I shall show a graph made by Oscar Sono Angada and Thomas Perot that succinctly organizes the positive effects of psychedelics and entheogens. So I'll go ahead and give you guys some time to look at it. Go ahead and read it over. So, as we can see, both psychedelics and entheogens have been positively correlated with the experiences of both mindfulness and compassion, and almost more importantly, self-compassion. Anyone would like to read more about the intersection of psychedelics, mindfulness, and compassion, I encourage you to read the link in my transcript, which will be linked after this, the one titled, Can a Psychedelic Experience Improve Your Life? It summarizes quite well everything that I like to talk about in terms of healing through psychedelics. So now that we know that psychedelic experiences and meditation bring about a state of mindfulness, which in turn promotes both compassion and self-compassion, let's talk about what compassion is. I'm going to focus mostly on self-compassion because I'm sure we all have a general understanding of what compassion is, but less common is that people know about self-compassion or how to engage in it. However, I am here to make the case that self-compassion is as important, if not more important, than compassion to others. Granted, that is still very, very important. So to do so, I'm going to be reading some excerpts from Kristen D. Neff's Compassion and Wisdom in Psychotherapy, specifically Chapter 6, which is the chapter on self-compassion. So here is her description of compassion and self-compassion. To understand what is meant by the term self-compassion, it is useful to first consider what it means to feel compassionately more generally. When we experience compassion, we notice and are moved by the suffering of others. Rather than rushing past a homeless man begging for change on your way to work, for example, you might actually stop to consider how difficult his life must be. The moment you see the man as an actual human being who is suffering, your heart connects with him. Compassion literally means to suffer with. Instead of ignoring him, you find that you're moved by his pain and feel the urge to help in some way. And importantly, if what you feel is true compassion rather than simply pity, you may say to yourself, there but for the grace of God go I. If I had been born in different circumstances or maybe had been just unlucky, I might also be struggling to survive. We're all vulnerable. Compassion, therefore, presupposes the recognition and clearer seeing of suffering. It entails feelings of kindness, care, and understanding for people who are in pain, so that the desire to ameliorate suffering naturally emerges. Finally, compassion involves recognizing the shared human condition, fragile and imperfect as it is. Self-compassion has exactly the same qualities. It's just compassion turned inwards. So, essentially, instead of shaming yourself when things go wrong or when you mess up, treat yourself like you would treat a good friend of yours. Shaming yourself, contrary to the belief of many, does not motivate you. It merely perpetuates your suffering. Not only that, but the more you shame and criticize yourself, the deeper those thought patterns get ingrained in your mind, and life has the potential to become quite negative. In case you aren't quite convinced, here are some scientifically based reasons to practice self-compassion. I'm going to read just the findings, but the researchers who developed these ideas will be on screen. So, self-compassion is associated with greater wisdom and emotional intelligence, which suggests that self-compassion represents a wise way of dealing with difficult emotions. For instance, self-compassionate people engage in rumination and thought suppression less often than those low in self-compassion. They also report greater emotional coping skills, including more clarity about their feelings and greater ability to repair negative emotional states. Self-compassion appears to bolster positive states of well-being. For example, self-compassion is associated with feelings of social connectedness, and life satisfaction, important elements of a meaningful life. It is also linked to feelings of autonomy, competence, and relatedness, suggesting that self-compassion helps meet the basic psychological needs that Deci and Ryan argue are fundamental to well-being. Self-compassionate people tend to experience more happiness, optimism, curiosity, and positive effect than those who lack self-compassion. By wrapping one's pain in the warm embrace of self-compassion, positive feelings are generated that help balance the negative ones. And I did see that someone raised their hand. I didn't see exactly who it was, but you can either go ahead and type your question or your comment into the chat, or you can go ahead and just speak it now. But okay, I'm going to continue on. Oops, oh no, I did it again. 1 second. Hope this doesn't mess up the recording too much. Okay.
Just to let you know, Emily, I think co-hosts can unmute, but nobody else can unmute themselves right now. But they could put it in the chat till we're done with the presentation.
Okay. Good to know. Thank you. I appreciate that. Okay, cool. And let's see. Okay. Go back one slide. Dang it. I hate it when I do this. Okay, there we go. Current slide. Okay. All right, we're back. Okay. So as we can see, practicing self-compassion seems to be an important way to help oneself adjust to the struggles of life and the feeling of occasional failure. Instead of feeling beaten down by failure or struggle, we can learn to support ourselves when other people are not able to do so. It is good to be your own best friend sometimes. Bringing it all back around, psychedelics can help bring about a state of mindfulness, which brings a sense of self-compassion, which creates unconditional self-worth, which is an incredibly powerful thing. Unconditional self-worth can help you become the best you can be, which in turn helps the world around you. Gosh dang it. Okay, sorry. There's like a little bit of a delay, like when I click that. Oh, sorry, y'all. Oh my goodness.
It's okay. You're doing fine, Emily. You got time.
Oh, thanks. I appreciate that. Okay, maybe I shouldn't be so hard on myself, eh? Okay. Let's see. Okay, so another concept I would like to briefly brush on before we turn to the discussion of these topics, and that is the feeling of oneness. Both Buddhism and psychedelics converge at the point of this human experience. Buddhism, in a lot of ways, is the striving to achieve self-transcendence, and the ideology values those moments greatly. Psychedelics have a tendency to bring about these moments, and this is usually what we call ego death. Since we cannot be experiencing an ego death from psychedelics our whole lives, we can instead bring back that feeling of oneness by meditating and striving for that feeling in other ways. Note, ego death is the extreme form of the feeling of oneness. One can have that realization and feel it deeply, without fully losing the ego. I personally have never experienced an ego death, but I shall when I am ready to do so. No matter what, we must learn to let go of the ego in order to dissolve feelings of, I am not okay unless I have this thing, or I'm not okay if I mess something up, etc. Through this, we can have compassion for ourselves and for others no matter what. And as we have seen, compassion for self and others is linked to higher levels of both emotional well-being, which is a hedonic well-being, or eudaimonic well-being, the intercontentedness words. In conclusion, long-term happiness is not about what you own or what you wear. It is about who you are and how you treat those around you and yourself. Psychedelics and the continued practice of things, such as meditation and the Eightfold Path, can help you truly bring you into these conclusions so as to practice the conclusions in your daily life and make life a little better for yourself and everyone else too. Fill thy cup and it shall overflow. So thanks everyone. As always, I'm excited to hear what you all have to say about this, and thanks for joining me. And that is it. Okay, how do I shop?